for having me. A couple housekeeping items that I wanted to announce. One is that you may know that Samantha Boland, who organizes these events, she emailed, actually she's just out there, so I'm not sure she is hearing me, but she's actually leaving to help run the Multiple Sclerosis Society of New England. But I was going to give her a hand, but she's actually giving coffee to someone. So. The other thing is that Liza Dougal is over there. She's with the Brain and Cognitive Lab at Northeastern, and she's looking for research subjects. So if you would like to contribute to science, you should see Liza over there. Yeah. Okay, so there's a lot to talk about in this domain, and I'm hoping today that I can maybe answer a few of your questions, and I'll probably open up more questions as we go along, but this is a really difficult and moving, rapidly moving space. So let's dive in. But one more thing, actually, before we get really into social media and news, and I just wanted to mention that you may know that Northeastern, its alums, its current faculty has a very interesting and tight relationship with the Boston Globe and the media community in Boston. And one way that that was manifest in a very prominent way in the last couple of years is that this very important investigation that Walter Robinson, who's a Northeastern alum, and Matt Carroll, who's a Northeastern alum, both of whom are on the faculty right now, was featured in a film called Spotlight, which many of you probably have seen. It won the Academy Award for Best Picture. Robbie Robinson and Matt Carroll were a big part of the kind of run-up as people campaign for Oscars, and we're really lucky to have that connection and that kind of global visibility for our journalism school. We would love to have more alumni involved. We're doing events. Just tomorrow we have a big event called Is Trump Making Investigative Journalism Great Again? So you're free to come. It's on the Northeastern campus. You can find it online. I'm happy to provide details. So we're doing a lot of really, I think, exciting things as a school, as a program. And we're part of the College of Arts, Media, and Design, which is a relatively new administrative unit, but is trying to pull together the design community, the information and communications communities, the arts community into a sort of single administrative unit, and it's really exciting. Okay, let's dive in. So Joe was good enough to kind of talk about and to solicit from you guys the kinds of patterns that we are seeing in terms of accessing news and information. Some of these slides may be a little tough to discern, so I'll just kind of give you the headline on a lot of things, and feel free to ask questions as we move along. So the question that may be on your mind as you saw the room, we have most people still consuming news through newspapers and television. Are the younger generations, the so-called millennials, 18 to 34, Generation X, of which I'm a part, people in their sort of late 30s and 40s, are we consuming news in a wholly different way than older generations? And the answer is not really. So some things are changing and some things are staying the same. And about 2/3 of adults who are online now say that they get some news from social media. So that would be maybe through Facebook or through Twitter, through YouTube, other kind of socially mediated technologies. People make a little bit of a categorical mistake when they say 2/3 of Americans are getting their news from social media. That's not quite true. So people are still watching television, consuming newspapers, in large numbers. So it's a kind of a hybrid pattern that we're seeing. It may be that eventually these trend lines kind of play out and people are consuming virtually all of their news through social media, but we're not there yet. I think we're not even close. But one pattern that we're starting to see is that you would assume that younger demographics are the ones who are consuming news and information increasingly through the social media platforms, and whereas the older generations are sort of lagging in that respect. But that's starting to change. There's starting to be a flattening out as older Americans start to consume more news through social media, as non-white and less educated Americans start to consume more news that way. So we're starting to see the trends playing out across all the demographics. But again, it's still not uniform, and it's quite a kind of checkered picture. Hard to make big generalizations. But let me give you some other data points that I think are relevant. You talk about big data and you talk about scale. Just consider this statistic. So an estimated 2 billion digital images are posted on social media each day, and more than 1 billion hours of video are watched globally on YouTube alone. So the scale of consumption globally is quite extraordinary. So what's actually happening? Let me sort of set this up a little bit. So just to simplify what a social media platform really is, it is a information communications technology that allows for peer-to-peer direct communication. Right? So if I want to know what's going on right now in the world, I could pick this up. I could turn to Twitter. I could go to a certain handle called @RealDonaldTrump, and he is, through the miracle of this information communications technology, is actually tweeting peer-to-peer to me right now. In fact, he's talking about North Korea and some other really important things. It's extraordinary. President Obama did some of this as well. It should be said that President Trump is not the first president to communicate in this way, but it's pretty extraordinary to think about this kind of peer-to-peer relationship that we can kind of have with major figures, not only political, but celebrities, all kinds of people. We also, though, primarily use these tools to connect with friends, family, and communities. So the majority, it very much depends on the platform we're talking about if we're trying to characterize how they are used. So let's talk about Facebook first, and then I'm going to get to Twitter, and I'll make sense of this slide, which probably looks like a lot of craziness. But so Facebook was founded in 2004 by Mark Zuckerberg and his dorm room at Harvard. It pretty quickly grew as an application that was used in college settings. But then they expanded it out, and it caught on like wildfire, both with the American public and publics around the world. And it now has about 2 billion users, so some significant fraction of the globe. If you're not on Facebook, what one does after signing up is finds friends and connects with them. And as friends post messages and pictures, you see those messages and pictures, and you can respond to them. So that's the basic idea. Now, there's an increasingly important dimension which comes back to news, which is that Mark Zuckerberg and his crew of engineers are trying to figure out how computationally, using algorithms, they can provide news and information and updates from friends, family, and people around the world, including news outlets, that would engage you and be relevant to your life. And so they are constantly tweaking this formula that serves up this kind of information. So I think there's something like about 1,000 different possible things that you could see in a given day from your friends and sort of near network. That's about average, I think. And so what the algorithm has to do is choose among that 1,000, and maybe for some people it's many thousands of pieces of content, and kind of create, in effect, what's a kind of the analogy would be the front page of a newspaper, right? What's the most relevant 7 or 10 items from the possible universe of things? And so one thing that we are trying to think a lot about these days, especially in journalism and the media community writ large, is how are these algorithms deciding what's important? Are they serving up civically important information? Are they serving up frivolous stuff? Are they giving us that kind of good mix of a media diet that we would see from a professionally edited front page? And so there's a lot of controversy actually about what Facebook in particular, but other social media platforms are doing in terms of how they're judging what's relevant and what's important. So that controversy is going on. We'll get to fake news and some of the other things soon. But another really important platform is Twitter, and I mentioned that in the context of President Trump tweeting. And in many ways, Twitter is a much more open platform. So whereas Facebook requires you to accept friends who may want to follow you, Twitter does not. There are some privacy features, but pretty much nobody enables them. People want to be seen, they want to be heard. You can follow the president, you can follow celebrities, you can follow friends and colleagues. It's a very open and kind of chaotic network in a lot of ways, but it's sort of wonderful in that respect. So we hear a lot about viral media these days. This idea that information can kind of cascade from person to person, peer to peer, across distance very rapidly. It can seem quite surprising, some of the things that kind of flash out of nowhere and suddenly consume the public's attention. But that viral pattern is pretty rare, in fact. And so what I wanted to do is just show you the possible other patterns that we typically see on social media. I'll give you two versions of this. And these couple slides are from the Pew Research Center. So if you look at the top, I don't have a laser pointer, but if you look at the top left, you see two circles there. And this is a pattern that we would call roughly polarized crowds. So we know the United States has been increasingly dividing itself into blue and red, Republican and Democrat. And so when we see political topics discussed on social media, we often see what looks like a polarized crowd. Just to give you another kind of look at it, top left, that's polarized crowd. So think about the tax bill being discussed right now. If we mapped what's going on Twitter, the discourse, and it would be millions and millions of conversations and tweets, we would see, especially on politically radioactive topics, we would see that kind of polarized crowd. But that's not the only thing that we see on social media. Sometimes, if you look at the top right, we see things that where the conversation is almost wholly contained within a specific community. And so we could characterize that as a tight crowd. That might be, everybody who's interested in the changes in the recycling program in Greater Boston or something like that, right? Where maybe there's no real controversy, there's no real division, but people are actively discussing it and they're highly connected with one another around that given topic. There's also a phenomenon, because most of the major companies and businesses in the United States are now on these platforms, we also see a lot of interaction between the commercial sector and individuals. And this is pretty extraordinary. I mean, we see it manifest sometimes when people are quite upset about what an airline has done to them, lost their baggage, et cetera, canceled a flight. And so we'll see people directly saying, hey, Delta, hey, hey, American Airlines, you weren't very good to me. And you'll often see the brands themselves respond directly to customers. In fact, they have whole teams now that are kind of doing this rapid response as a way of trying to get ahead of potential problems, and also just to be good citizens and provide good service. So sometimes we see what we're called brand clusters, and sometimes in the lower right you'll see what are called sort of support networks, and that's when you might have a given business or company or institution that's responding to a bunch of complaints or to a bunch of feedback. In any case, if you look at the bottom left, we see that traditional pattern of news, and that is the broadcast pattern. That is the one-to-many pattern. That is the pattern that characterizes the Boston Globe when it throws a newspaper on everyone's doorstep, when they're printing on time. Right? It's what characterizes the television broadcast signal going out, where it originates to everyone's television or radio. Right? So there's a central hub in the middle, and then there's a million spokes or nodes outside of that. So this is a Twitter map. This is representing the same set of patterns: polarized crowds, tight crowds, brand clusters, community clusters, broadcast networks, support networks. So this is all to say, and it may be a little confusing, but it's all to say that the patterns of information access and information engagement are quite varied on social media. They're not uniform. And I mentioned that this viral pattern, which seems to really be distinctive of our age, quite different than the old broadcast one-to-many model. It's this sort of many-to-many model where things are sort of flying around in these unpredictable cascades. Again, pretty rare. In fact, when things are highly popular on social media, all the research tells us that it's almost always correlated with the fact that some big news organization, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, got involved at some point in the social media platform and decided to rebroadcast the piece of information, validate it somehow. So news media, rather than kind of going away on social media, play a very, very key kind of curation role in terms of bringing things to the attention of the public. By the way, this is the Polarized crowd. I forget what the topic is here, but it's another Pew Research Center kind of map, network map, and the two groups are discussing something, a subject in common. I believe this was from the Obama era, but they're not really talking to one another. They're really talking to each other. Okay, so I had mentioned the globe and the connection with Spotlight. And one thing that has been really exciting is because Matt Carroll, who is the data journalist on that team, and Walter Robinson, who is the team leader of the Spotlight team in that series, because they're both colleagues, I've been trying, for the book I'm writing, to really think through what happened with the Priest Abuse scandal. How is it that something that was known to many people in sort of small pockets, families, small communities, how is it that in a matter of weeks and months it became a global phenomenon? And I think the answer is that what we saw in that, and I'll explain this diagram in a second, was one of the first instances where a communications technology that allowed for peer-to-peer connection, namely email. We don't think about it, but email is a kind of social media. It allows for peer-to-peer direct connection. And if you ask Matt and ask Robbie, like, what was the difference? Because you guys had stories in this area before. Other outlets, the Phoenix, other newspapers around the world had sort of looked at this a little bit, but nobody had put all the pieces together. And if you ask them, what was really the difference? One, they would say, well, we got the court documents. If you've seen the movie, you know that's a really essential piece. And publishing those in the newspaper, you sort of really tipped things into a different scale. But secondly, email. Email was really important. The fact that people were able to forward the article, not just sort of pass it along through an envelope, which people have traditionally done. We've all put, articles up on our refrigerator and then sent a copy to an aunt or an uncle. And that's a very long, time scale. But what happened was email really accelerated the mutual awareness of this problem. Pretty soon, you can't see it probably exactly, but the top dotted line is all of these other reporters around the world emailing Matt and Robbie and Sasha and Mike Resendez, the other people on the team, and saying, how did you get this story? How do we report this story? What's the formula for breaking this story? And so pretty soon, the formula for breaking the story became sort of widely known. It was almost sort of a code to crack. And if you watch that movie and you watch the final credits, you see all of the cities that were affected. And in almost all of those cities, news reporters, kind of took the template that these folks did and sort of ran with it. But this, in any case, is a kind of network map that begins with the victims. The Spotlight team has a sort of a kind of an intervention, and then it sort of grows and ultimately becomes a global phenomenon. I want to talk a little bit about what journalists do in this sort of new networked environment. If you think about it, many things are going on simultaneously across the country and across the world, which are known to sort of what we might call small worlds, right? A given community. Think about the community in Ferguson, Missouri, right? Where it was sort of widely known that there were bad community police relations, and that there were some real problems, but it wasn't sort of known outside of that circle. Think of Flint, Michigan, where recently the problems with contaminated water were finally exposed. And then suddenly, seemingly in an instant, all of these other communities across the United States said, hey, we have problems with contaminated water too. Right? How does Ferguson, how does the Spotlight story, how does Flint, how do all these things catch on so quickly? And I would say one of the important things are these peer-to-peer technologies, social media. And I think increasingly what we might think about journalists doing, and this is what I'm trying to think through quite a bit, is these communities, you see at the top there, which are disparate. They're not connected by links, right? And what journalism, I think, at its best and its sort of highest, of course journalism has many things wrong with it, and we could go through those later, but I think what it does is it helps communities to form sort of mutual awareness, to form these sort of links of that may just be a common and sort of mutual understanding that one's problems are not particular to an individual, but rather maybe quite widespread or even universal. And that mutual awareness, I think, starts to build attention, which could then drive policymakers to take action. And so I think that's kind of the pattern that we're seeing in journalism. It's an old pattern. Journalists have always been connectors, I think, right? They've always been trying to bring relevant information to publics. But in the world of peer-to-peer technologies and social media, I think we can start to imagine journalism doing more of a kind of network building. And I think it's useful to think about it in that way. Okay, so I'm giving a kind of happy story about the press and about news right now, right? All right. So then there's the other piece, which is the narrative of fake news and the decline of mainstream media. Where does that all fit in? And so here is a graphic that I've been kind of working on for my book, which is, and this data comes from the General Social Survey, which is probably our best kind of apples to apples, year over year data picture of the American public on a lot of important questions. And they have been asking since 1973, and you'll see Watergate's actually, I sort of annotated the map with the help of my colleague, Aleshu Bayek, who's also in the journalism program. We've been having fun together with this. So the General Social Survey has been asking, do you trust the press, basically, since 1973. So we can see the trend lines. And what's interesting to think about here is that when people, the kind of the lay account of why do people hate the press or why is there a lot of mistrust these days, people say, well, it must be because people are shouting on cable, right? They don't like that. I don't like that. It's rancorous. It's not. It doesn't make me like the press very much. Or they would say, well, it's the internet, right? The internet has created a lot of really bad information and kind of junk information, and the press is responsible for a lot of that. But what you notice from this trend is that actually the decline in trust in news media predates both cable and the internet. The trend starts prior to that. Right after Watergate, and I'm sure some folks in this room remember this quite vividly, right? The press was held in quite high regard. It was almost a heroic time where Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein and others broke this amazing story that really brought down President Nixon. So the press had kind of a heroic standing and stature with the public at that point. That lasted for a few years, and then it started to decline pretty steadily. Why that is, I think, requires some really deep kind of cultural digging. I will say that the Nixon White House actually was the first to really articulate this idea of nattering nabobs of negativity and some of the other wonderful phrases that come from that era, but really started to talk about the media as the media. That was really the sort of the first moment, and it accelerated in the 80s and in the 90s. But if you ask people, just post-Watergate, do you trust the press? 84% or so said either I trust the press a lot or I trust it some. Right? That number is now down near about 50%, right? With a lot of that being just some. And the percentage of people who are saying hardly any has gone from single digits up to almost 50%. So there's a sea change going on. I think it's really important. It's one of the central questions right now for news outlets, for professional journalists. How do we cope with this lack of trust? What is it? It is no doubt somewhat related to the rise of the ideological right, which has built a lot of communications apparatus. So Fox News, incredibly important in this trend. But it's also, it's not a trend that isn't found among liberals and sort of centrists too. So I think part of the reason that people are trusting the press less has to do with the rise of different kinds of conservative media, but I do think there are other drivers and explanations, and I won't belabor that point. But it's worth pointing out too, in the context of social media and news, that people don't think about it because it seems such near history. But if you look at the sort of far right of the graph, I put in a couple kind of landmark events. Think about this. In 2004, Facebook is founded. In 2005, YouTube is founded. In 2006, Twitter is founded. Probably the three most important social technologies. And then 2007, the very next year, the iPhone comes online. It was a tremendous, I think when historians look back, it was probably, I don't know what we put it on a par with, but in terms of innovation in American history, it was an extremely fertile moment. And I think we're still living with the consequences of it. And frankly, the engineers and executives who are running these companies are still trying to figure it out themselves. Just recently, Twitter, which had said you can only use 140 characters in order to broadcast messages to people. They wanted really short messages because it was more fun. They said, actually, we're going to double that. It's going to be 280. So they just sort of fundamentally changed the rules of the game on this platform that's used by many hundreds of millions of people. It does suggest that even the executives and the engineers are figuring this out. What does the public want? How should we communicate? What's optimal? How can we sell ads against all this? Right? They're still figuring it out, and we're in that very near history, which makes it exciting but also a little scary. So just to put a little finer point on the confidence in institutions piece. Journalism, so the Journal Source Survey has been asking about all kinds of other institutions, scientific institutions, military institutions, Congress, Supreme Court, etc. And it is true that there seems to be a secular, fairly steady decline in the public's evaluation of large institutions in our society. We seem to be in an anti-institutional age of sorts. But it's worth noting that the press remains a little bit of an outlier, even relative to these other institutions. And so that's, again, a real dilemma and a challenge for professional journalists, and I think people who care about the quality of our democracy. How do we have a sense of shared reality? How do we have a sense of common facts from which we can deliberate under these conditions? So, okay, so people may not like what's going on cable, right? The shout fest that we see there. They may not like the kind of the chaos of the internet as compared to the old days where there was, an anchor maybe telling you like it is, maybe Cronkite, maybe Brokaw. Is it still the case though that the public values this kind of quality, high quality, kind of social mission-driven journalism that we would see, for example, in the Spotlight series? And overall, in this Pew Research Center data again, a majority of the public supports news media's watchdog role. This idea we got to hold the powerful accountable, right? We got to hold those crooked politicians to account when they're crooked. And but what's happening is even that watchdog role, which I think got a kind of amen, hallelujah chorus in decades past, there's starting to be a partisan division even on the watchdog role, which is troubling. So in 2017, Pew in its survey data found that the public was really displaying a divide that was wider than had ever been measured before. Okay. I talked a little bit about the flattening out of the public in terms of news access through social media. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of a picture of the various generational cohorts and how they consume news. And as we did that little informal poll that Joe conducted at the beginning, I think it may conform to what we're seeing in the room. But obviously there are counter trends. So among the group 18 to 29, the online media are the primary source of where people often get their news. A little more mixed, 30 to 49. Among the 50 to 64 group, TV is far and away the biggest source of news, and then 65 plus, TV and newspapers sort of rule the day. Now, a couple things to remember, and I always like to point this out to my students and to other people, to other audiences I'm talking to, which is that news is more than just politics, right? We tend to focus on the most outrageous or extreme thing that's being said by a member of Congress or a partisan person of one sort or another, a pundit. But news is, in fact, if we look at the pie, right, the kind of the pie chart of what people consume, traffic and weather, sports, environment, your local town and community, business, healthcare, not in the political sense, but just in, what are the trends, consume a big piece of that pie chart. And in fact, I'd say it's, the overwhelming majority. Politics is something that citizens actually don't plug into as much as you would think. This is across the populace. And it tends to be that there is a segment that really feels passionately about politics, follows it. They're sort of new politics junkies. But a lot of the country only really tunes in during election time or when there's something really serious going on, like a foreign war. And that's a pattern that's characterized the American public over generations, which is the average person doesn't pay much attention to politics unless they have to. Right? And increasingly, I think, because we have so many different media channels, it's an era of abundance rather than scarcity. A lot of people are actually kind of checking out of public affairs news, going towards entertainment, going towards soft news, going towards just sports and other things that amuse them. Think about the era in which many of us grew up, which was there weren't a lot of options on TV, right? There were 3 channels, and the news was on at certain points, and that was really the only thing that you had if you wanted to consume broadcast media. Okay, TV. One thing that we're doing at the journalism school is we've embarked on a research project called Reinventing Local TV News. The hypothesis we have is that news stations could capture bigger shares of the audience, do civically more important work if they change the way they do things. You may, just reflect for a second. The kind of newscasts you see at 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 or whenever you happen to catch it, not really that different than 30 or 40 years ago, is it? I mean, the graphics are a little fancier, but really the template is there. And one of the things that continues to, I think, kind of plague local TV news, and I'll come back to social in a second, but I want to make a point about this, is that it's overwhelmingly focused on crime. Right? Overwhelmingly focused on crime, which I think, and I'm not alone in this, for generations scholars have said, this gives the public a really distorted picture of reality, our sense of what the real risks are, right? The risks may be, health related, maybe environmentally related. They're often not related to violent crime. But in any case, that's the picture we're still being given from a lot of local news stations. I think it's lamentable. And what's interesting is that people had predicted the end of local sort of TV news or TV news writ large a number of years ago, but it really hasn't happened. People are still tuning in large numbers. It's still quite influential in terms of shaping public opinion. Anyway, that's a little bit of an aside. A couple other data points that I think are important to think about in the context of social media and news. The number of persons who are employed professionally to deliver news to communities across the country has been cut roughly in half over the last couple decades. There were about 60,000, 58,000 editorial workers in newspapers across the country at the end of the Cold War, and we're now probably around 30,000. Which is an extraordinary decline. I've heard someone say that it may be the most rapid percentage-wise decline of any industry, including the steel industry. I don't know if that's empirically true, but it's something interesting to think about what the meaning of this is, right? So these kind of, the people who nominally have, an ethical code and a professional duty to be fair and impartial and to try to render the best, most accurate picture of reality, there are just many fewer of them. And then this, I think, does have consequences in terms of social media and the kinds of news and information that people are consuming there. Why is that happening? Well, this has to do with social media. The way to advertise to people these days is not to just throw the proverbial spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks, which is really what a television commercial is, right? It's like, it may be relevant to me, it may not be, but we're going to throw it up there. There's a famous observation from a prominent person in the advertising world, whose name I'm forgetting, but who said, I know that sort of half of my advertising dollars worked, but I just don't know which half, right? But that world's starting to be gone. And the reason is because the social media companies, and I include Google here too, which is a huge player in all of this, which provides both search engine capacity, you can search for things, but it also owns YouTube. It also has sort of tentacles out in many different spaces that relate to social media. In any case, what they can do is collect data on all of us as individuals and then target ads to us, right? It's a much more promising model. If you're a small business, if you're a large business or a large corporation, much better, right? I can reach the exact 10,000 people who need cat food right now, right? Much better than throwing the spaghetti at the wall. And so what's happened is that the money that's traditionally gone to the TV networks and to the newspapers, right? Think of all those big ads you saw from the mainstream department stores, Main Street department stores back a couple decades ago, it's pretty much evaporated. And so we see that just as an example, the roughly $67 billion in advertising revenue, which is the lifeblood of newspapers, has been cut down to maybe $15 billion now, and almost all of the new ad revenue has gone to Google and Facebook, basically. 90% or so of all new online ad dollars just go to those two companies. So people are talking a lot these days about a duopoly, and there's a lot of talk about regulatory reform. There's even talk about are these monopolies, what should we do about them? I think that's really in its fledgling state, and obviously the people in Silicon Valley who run these companies strenuously object and say, no, we're providing a very important service to the global public, and we're different than the old industrial monopoly. So that war's being waged, but it is entirely possible that if we all come back here in a few years, that we'll be talking about how, as with Ma Bell, that some of these communications companies are split up, or we don't know. We just don't know. It's very fluid. Okay, so there are positive signs if you're a liberal these days and consuming news media, right, from a revenue perspective. Thanks to Trump, the New York Times added more subscribers in 3 months than in all of 2015. This was an early headline after he was elected. By the way, some of these patterns, obtained when George W. Bush was elected, when Barack Obama was elected. People sort of react. Sometimes they vote with their wallet to go and say, oh, okay, I'm going to subscribe to X, Y, or Z as a kind of a political thing or as a conscience thing. So, but President Trump has definitely fired up the liberal community. The TV ratings, the subscription numbers for some of the national outlets have been quite good. Though I will point out that Fox News, I think, just again surpassed MSNBC in terms of ratings. So, it's a topsy-turvy world and nothing is certain. Okay, one thing that's really, really important is the intertwined nature of mobile technology and social media and socially accessed news and information. So mobile is not always social, but I think there are a variety of kind of cultural reasons why when people start to consume news and information on the phone, they start to often do it in a socially mediated platform or in a social context. They are in some deep way interrelated. And so the adoption of the mobile phone as a technology seems to be driving a lot of this social media time. I'll talk about time in a second. By the way, this is the New York Times virtual reality app, where you can go to Mecca, or you can explore strange new places in really fabulous ways. hard. This is hard to read, but just think about this for a second. I'll interpret it for you. In 2010, Americans were consuming roughly 31 minutes of mobile internet. Fast forward about 7 years later, consuming 195 minutes of mobile internet. So, you know, when people study any kind of societal pattern, like a 6-fold increase in anything is just extraordinary. So we're something, you know, very deep in terms of the habits of our citizens is going on. It's really consequential, and it's consequential for news and information flows. Okay, how am I doing on time, Joe? Okay. Give me the vaudeville hook when you need to. So I have a few ideas that I hope you find interesting, maybe provocative, and maybe not, about what's going on with news these days. Let me actually skip ahead. There is, I think, among a lot of people, a lot of citizens, both here in the United States and across the world, this sense that the world is kind of spinning out of control. And for liberal communities, it may be, you know, mostly about the election of President Trump, but it seems to transcend that, right? And even among conservatives and centrists, there's a sense that like things are just going crazy. Now, should be said, in other eras, people also thought everything was going crazy. And for those of you, who lived through World War II, the 60s, right? I mean, things maybe were objectively crazier during those days. I don't know, right? So sometimes it's all where you stand. But there's this I think, pervasive sense of a kind of fatigue with news these days. It just seems negative. It just seems just wholly. I have students who say, I just don't want to tune into the news today. I want to have a good day. I just had a student say that, and I understand. And I've been trying to think through why is that. So here's a little kind of social science, social psychology theory that I'm kind of importing over. So what happens when people consume news and information not in a broadcast pattern, passively reading the newspaper, right, or watching the television, but rather consume news and information that's recommended and commented on by all of your friends and family, right? That's the question. A lot of that's going on, right? So more news items are coming to the attention of citizens through these social channels. News is becoming more of a social experience. And it would stand to reason, based on what we know from social psychology, that these social ties sort of kind of activating emotions and activating. Think about a friend who's really passionate about the Syrian civil war and all the tragedy and trauma that's gone on there, and that person posting that to Facebook, and then you seeing that and seeing her reaction and her concern, right? That becomes partly your concern. That's something new in how we consume news and information, and I think it could be really consequential. And I think it's worth thinking about, like, what does that do to a society at scale, right? Not just individually, that sense of news fatigue or that sense of outrage or that high emotion, but what does it do at scale? And I think it's magnifying the emotional effect of news. I don't have a whole sort of research body of evidence to support that, but I think that may be what's going on. And so that the net result is the increasing influence and power of news stories across the population. I think that's possible. We're also just consuming more media, not just news, but all kinds of media. Here's another hypothesis, and I think it may explain something. Many of the partisan shows, you think of MSNBC and Fox News, I'll just call them out in particular, a lot of what they're doing, and a lot of talk radio, is kind of making fun of the other side, saying, hey, look what they're talking about today. This is absurd, right? So media criticism, media sort of awareness of what the other side is saying and doing and thinking about, is a huge piece of what is going on in news media these days. And I think that is possibly an explanation for a little bit of the polarization that we're seeing. Again, I couldn't prove it. There's something in the social psychology literature called the third person effect. And the third person effect, I'll just read out the slide here. In its broadest formulation, this hypothesis predicts that people will tend to overestimate the influence that mass communications have on the attitudes and behavior of others. And this is from an academic, Phillips Davidson. He wrote this paper in the 1980s, and it's been proven out again and again. We tend to think, when we're looking over the fence at the neighbor and we see what's going on over there, we tend to think, wow, that's, whatever messages they are receiving are going to be really consequential with them, which is all to say, we're sort of looking over the fence and we're kind of scared at what's happening on the other side. When really, if you went over and asked that neighbor, like, so is Rachel Maddow or Sean Hannity, like, really influential in your mind on politics? A lot of people would say, not really. I watch it, I kind of agree with a lot of it, but it's not actually that consequential. But the third person effect tells us that we tend to overestimate that effect. So in other words, it's a little bit of a function of distrust, I think, a little bit in the basic rationality of fellow citizens. And because news media has become so kind of meta about reporting on what the other side is doing and saying, I think it's feeding into a kind of feedback loop on that, and maybe accelerating a little bit of the polarization. I know it's a little bit of a complicated point and maybe convoluted points, but I wanted to raise it. Okay, I think I probably should take questions pretty soon, but I'm going to skip over a few slides here. I want to talk about fake news for a second, because it's something that's very much on the minds of everyone, and it's obviously has many different connotations, and it began in some respects as a description of certain kinds of news and information that was being purveyed by the social media platforms or through the social media platforms by people who in some respects were not necessarily Russian, though that appears to be part of the explanation, but who were just trying to make money. So anything with the words Clinton and Trump during the election, you could sell ads against. People were clicking on it. And so if you created content, no matter how outrageous, using those words, you could sell ads, right, through these platforms. So fake news, was kind of coined in that sense. And then, of course, President Trump and his allies kind of turned the phrase to talk about what they believe to be the sort of state of and quality of mainstream news media. We could have a huge debate over, what does that term really mean? But the people who are really thinking about this deeply, this comes from the Reuters Institute at Oxford, and I'll show you another slide in just a second. They note that fake news can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, and if you talk with people, like, what do you mean by fake news? They sometimes mean things like, well, it's satire. Right? Many of you may know The Onion, which does this great kind of humor, and sometimes quite colorful. So sometimes those are actually fake news articles. The Onion will, have some outrageous headline that's completely fake, but it's meant to be satire, and people are unclear what does that mean, because if they're not in on the joke, they take it too literally, they can think of it as something that's real news. Poor journalism, we talk about the trust numbers. Outright propaganda, right? So we're in a big debate about what Vladimir Putin and sort of Russian allies may or may not have done during the election. Some advertising masquerades as news, and increasingly news outlets are interested in producing advertisements, kind of advertorial is one, or native ads that look like news, masquerade as news, but are actually advertisements. So news media are contributing to this. And then sometimes they're just outright false news, right? Rumors, lies of various kinds. Worth noting, though, that in 1841 or so, a Scotsman who's forgetting his name as well, but wrote a book about all of the ridiculous falsehoods and weird beliefs and lies that had been purveyed over like several centuries. This is in 1841, right? So a lot of this stuff has been with us as human communities for a really long time, and it's not new. But maybe it's being accelerated by these technologies. This slide's a little tough to read. But this is the First Draft Coalition, which is this great group out of Columbia, now Harvard, which is trying to fight misinformation and disinformation. There are actually groups of journalists around the world who are kind of banding together to try to figure out what we can do, in almost like a kind of custodial way in these environments. How do we fight misinformation and disinformation? And they add a few other wrinkles to this, this kind of typology of fake news, and that would include manipulated content, false connections, false context, imposter content, in addition to satire and some of the other things that I talked about. Final point. This one's about knowledge. And I think this is where I think a lot of people are kind of getting concerned, right? Which is, what if actually the changes that we're starting to see being enacted through social media and news are actually the precursor for something much bigger in terms of how the public comes to understand reality? I don't know, but think about this. This old, sort of decades old paradigm for really the hierarchical construction of knowledge. We start with data, we move to information, we move to knowledge and maybe wisdom. And this is sort of the paradigm in the sciences, right? It's the paradigm in kind of the academic communities and the communities that have traditionally been the kind of the guardians and the gatekeepers of knowledge. But as what I like to call social facts start to emerge, we start to see things that are a little different. This slide's a little bit tough to explain, but I'm going to try to just walk through it real quick. So on the far left, number one would be knowledge as it's traditionally constructed, authorities, so experts, right? Political figures, canonical references. Knowledge is constructed in a particular way. It's often networked, right? But the nodes, the sources in each of those places has a kind of traditional authority. In the world of social media, new kinds of actors and new kinds of sources of information arise very quickly around any given piece or any network of knowledge. It's not that knowledge is changing, but it's the organization and the structure of how we understand knowledge can very quickly be unsettled and sort of travel. What we end up doing is having different, and social media contribute to this in huge ways, having different kinds of ways of understanding things. My canonical example in all of this is the Obama birth certificate issue, right? Which, for a time it was sort of a joke, right? It was contained in a very small, kind of dispersed community across the United States and maybe the world that thought that President Obama wasn't born in the United States. And despite all of the, here's the actual birth certificate and attempts to kind of inoculate against that kind of misinformation, it didn't work. And in fact, the controversy grew. And if we really think about how President Trump first came back on the national stage, it was actually through this issue. Remember, he was one of the people who was calling that into question. I think he's disavowed it a little bit. But it was extraordinary. Even late in Obama's second term, huge numbers of people still doubted it. Well, it was just a basic fact. In fact, it was a trivial fact at that point because he wasn't even up for re-election anymore or anything. Right? How did that happen? Well, part of it is that news media, having seen these sort of sparse new networks come alive through social media, said, well, the story may be ridiculous, but it appears that millions of people believe it because we can see that on Facebook and Twitter, right? So in this kind of way that social media becomes a snap opinion poll of the American public, well, a bunch of mainstream news outlets started reporting on the birth certificate issue, right? So then they validated the false narrative, right? Knowledge is being constructed in a new way. Social facts are coming into, are colliding with actual knowledge and facts. And so we have a really topsy-turvy world. And I think news reporters have to really think about this. If large portions of the public don't think that vaccines for children are a good idea, which is it's a phenomenon that's developing out there, do we report on that? It's a social fact that there's a large number of people who don't believe in vaccinations, a group called the anti-vaxxers, as the coinage is. But what do we do with that as news reporters? Do we validate it by reporting on the fact that there's this large growing community that doesn't believe in sort of medical knowledge? That's what we've ended up doing. But we know from the social science research that just by saying it in a prominent place, in a valid place, it reinforces it. And it starts to call into question, plants a seed of doubt in people's minds. I think this is probably the great challenge for news moving forward in the era of social media, which is, what do we do about the fact that the public, as it always has been, has tons of irrational thoughts and beliefs, And people have conspiracy theories and hoaxes in their head, and the internet really allows people who have kind of strange ideas to come together and to form communities. And once those communities coalesce, what do we do with them? Do we acknowledge them? Do we not? In any case, I'll leave you with that very, very unsettling thought. And I'll take questions if that's okay.
Okay, I believe we have some time for questions from the audience.
Hi.
How do you